Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Elijah Magnier joins us today, and we discuss the recent Israeli bombings in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, the political situation in Israel and in Lebanon, and the impending retaliation by Hezbollah. We also talk about the purpose and the importance of the occupation of the Tanf base in Syria and the battle for Idlib, including Turkey's realignment and the Astana agreement. Elijah Magnier is a veteran war correspondent and a political analyst with over 35 years' experience covering the Middle East and North Africa. We recorded this on August 30th, 2019. Elijah Magnier is here to talk to us about the situation in the Middle East, and he's written a couple of articles about the recent bombings of Israel in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and the what looks to be an impending retaliation attack by Hezbollah. And he's written two articles just in this past week about that, and I was hoping we could talk about that today. Elijah, how are you doing? You told me that you're home, but you're going to travel to the region soon?
Yes, hello, Joanne. Thank you for having me again. Yes, I'm traveling next week back to the Middle East. The tension is rising, and I think I should be there.
And you're going to be in Lebanon then?
Yes, I'm going to be in Lebanon, and then I have the intention to travel to Iraq and then back to Syria, and then we see how it goes, because it depends how the situation in Lebanon will evolve, and basically it depends on how the Israelis are going to respond to the Hezbollah response.
Right. So I think most people are kind of familiar with what's been going on, but there's a lot of things going on here, and I don't see it getting as much attention as usual. So maybe we should first just describe real quickly the latest attacks. There have been a number of attacks on Iraq, on the, what do we call it, Hashd al-Shabi units there, and then many strikes on Syria, but sort of most relevant to the current situation is the recent strikes on Lebanon. Now, this bombing of Lebanon, it's different than previous skirmishes between Israel and Hezbollah. You're saying it breaks some rules of engagement for the first time since 2006.
Yes, that's correct. So since 2006, this third war that Israel waged on Lebanon, after that war, there was an agreement of cessation of hostility. And the agreement was that neither of both sides, Hezbollah or Israel, will attack each other. And there were the agreement of UN Resolution 1701, and with that, they prevent any attack in Israel and establish the cessation of hostility. So what happened is Israel has been violating daily since 2006, the Lebanese airspace, but not only to collect information, but also to bomb Syria from Lebanon, particularly after 2011. And it violates the Lebanese airspace, the Lebanese territorial water. It sends drones on daily basis all over the country. I've been throughout the years in Lebanon, and you hear the drone all the time, either in Beirut or in the south of Lebanon, or on the road in different parts of the country. So what Israel is doing is really collecting all the time military information to collect and add to its bank of objectives in case there is a war in the Middle East. And for the record, it's always Israel who starts the war. There's always something going on between Hezbollah and Israel, a tit for tat. When Israel attack, Hezbollah retaliate. When Israel doesn't release prisoners according to a certain deal, Hezbollah attack and take prisoners or corpse. So it has been going on since until 2006, but since 2006, basically, is Israel is violating Lebanon and Syria's sovereignty. And what happened recently is, in the last couple of years, uh, Israel admit having bombed over 200 targets in Syria, and it takes advantage of the lack of readiness of President Bashar al-Assad, despite the insistence of its allies to respond. I mean, I remember a few months ago, they all sat down together, Bashar al-Assad and his allies within the axis of the resistance, i.e. Iran, Hezbollah, to agree and retaliate against Israel. But then President Assad changed his mind to the last moment, saying, I prefer to go toward Idlib and concentrate on the reconstruction. I don't want to open another window and let Israel bomb. When I finish and the Syrian population recovered, then I can stand to Israel and stop it from violating the Syrian sovereignty.
Right.
And he has a point. That's his opinion. This is how he sees it. Therefore, the allies refrain from doing anything because at the end of the day, it is President Assad who decides, not his allies. In Lebanon, what happened a week ago is, as usual, Syria and its allies are present on the Syrian geography. There is a war going on. Israel is violating the Lebanese war, the Lebanese sovereignty and the Syrian sovereignty. And what's happening is that there are always Syrian and Lebanese Hezbollah on the borders in the Golan Heights. And when we say the Golan, just make sure for the audience to understand there are several kilometers separating the occupied Golan area from the first Syrian inhabited village. So it's not really standing on the borders and doing something on the border that threat the Israeli occupation forces. It is in the area that is between the borders. And this information hasn't been shared around. There were 5 people on the borders, and these 5 people returned from the Golan to their villa 10 to 12 kilometers from the Damascus airport, and in the night the Israelis came and bombed their home, which is it's not a military base, but they belong to Hezbollah and there are Syrian and Syrian allies in that home, and killed 2 Hezbollah. And because the killing of the 2 Hezbollah militants, the leader of Hezbollah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, warned Israel repetitively not to kill Lebanese militant intentionally, otherwise he will retaliate. And not only Israel killed 2 Lebanese Hezbollah, but they also sent 2 suicide drones capable of going into a window in a building. And one of these 2 suicide drones exploded inside a building, damaging another building nearby and violating the cessation of hostility and provoking Hezbollah to a response. So what Hezbollah did, said, okay, you want me to respond, I'm going to respond. And now the whole Middle East is waiting for Hezbollah to respond, and the Israeli army is hiding on the border, is no longer patrolling the border, and they are there, but there are several thousand invisible soldiers. They used to be around 24 hours a day, and they are afraid of being hunted down by a sniper or by a missile or whatever revenge Hezbollah is going to take. Not only to take a revenge, but just to say to Netanyahu, if you hit us back, if you hit us, we're going to hit you back. So basically, this is a deterrence act to tell Israel not to continue, not because Hezbollah is looking for war, and I don't think Israel is looking for war, but hopefully Israel will not be dragged to a war just to prove that they are bombing, as they are doing, as they have done in Lebanon, they're doing in Syria, they are doing it in Iraq, and they're doing it in Yemen.
Now, the last time we talked, things were already stirring, and that's when Nasrallah responded to you or one of your statements, and it's hard from my perspective. It's hard to know why this attack was different than previous skirmishes that they had. Is it because they deliberately killed the two Hezbollah militants, or is it because they admitted to these strikes, or what makes this one different? I'm sorry if I'm being dense here, but I'm a little confused because they're always fighting, it seems like.
Okay, so a few months ago, when Nasrallah said there is going to be a war, the Lebanese officials were very upset because they consider it is the tourism season and Lebanon is going through financial difficulties. So Nasrallah denied it, and we are here today exactly what Nasrallah denied.
Right.
We are in a state where Nasrallah was right of seeing the future going toward the war, but not only because of that, but also because what's happening against Iran, because everybody thought that the Americans are going to provoke Iran into a confrontation, and Iran made sure to provide its allies in Lebanon, Syria, and in Iraq enough precision missile to launch against the Americans and the Israelis once the war starts.
Okay.
So now we are today in a situation where it all depends on Israel to start a war or not. It's not in the hand of Hezbollah. Therefore, Hezbollah gave the instruction to empty all the offices. There are thousands of offices spread all over the country because Israel can start a war and hit back. And the first thing to hit back is the bank of objectives that Israel has been collecting for the last 13 years and start a war. By hitting the first office, Hezbollah is going to retaliate, and then Israel is going to hit, and then this is how war starts. So basically what Hezbollah denied a few months ago is happening today. The difference today is if Hezbollah doesn't reply to the Israeli violation of 3 points. So Israel hit Hezbollah militants in Syria. Israel sent 2 suicide drones in Beirut. It's a suburb of Beirut, but still Beirut. I mean, Beirut is all packed jump.
Right.
And the third attack was immediately after the threat of Nasrallah. There was an Israeli attack against the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command of Ahmed Jibril in the Bekaa Valley. So they bombed Lebanon, and Nasrallah said, if you bomb Lebanon, I'm going to bomb back. And Israel bombed before the threat twice, and then bombed after the threat. It's like Netanyahu saying, yes, come on, bomb Israel.
Yeah, well, and then we have the political situation. Now, Nasrallah, as far as I know, is still in a secure political position, although maybe that something has changed. But for those who don't know, I think it's September 19th, there are the Israeli elections had to basically do them over because the elections in the spring, Netanyahu won, but it was a narrow win, and then he was not able to form a government, and therefore they have to do the elections again. So, in just a few weeks, about 3 weeks from now, there's going to be another election. Now, Elijah, in your articles, you mentioned that is a factor in the timing, that you believe that Hezbollah will retaliate and that they will do it before this election to damage Netanyahu. Now, the other option, the thing that's confusing for me is that I've always heard that Netanyahu is bad, but the alternatives are even worse. So I find it curious that they would want to damage Netanyahu. So that's kind of a compound question there. But can we talk about the political aspect of this?
Yes. So a few months ago, Hezbollah didn't have the support of the Lebanese politicians who criticized any talk about war because of the tourism season and the financial situation. Today is completely different. Today is the president of the country who came and declared the Israeli act as an act of war with the right of Lebanon to retaliate. The prime minister, who is pro-American and with carrying a Saudi passport, Prime Minister Saad Hariri, came out and he's rejecting any sort of mediation and saying Hezbollah has a right to retaliate and Lebanon has a right to defend itself. Therefore, and there are between 250 to 300,000 tourists and Lebanese who fled Lebanon in the last few days, all just afraid of a possible war.
Oh.
Therefore, today, Lebanon is living a complete different situation where Hezbollah has a full support to threaten Israel, and the reason why Hezbollah threatened Israel is to tell Israel, I'm going to attack you for you to learn not to attack me again. So it is to stop a war, not to attack again, not for the snowball to continue going down the slope. Now, Hezbollah had this domestic full support today from the government and from the presidency, and is much stronger, in a much stronger position to continue to go for a hit to Israel and continue toward a war if necessary and if Netanyahu chooses. Now, you asked me about Netanyahu. Yes. Last month, a few months ago, Hezbollah said, I'm not going to interfere in the Israeli election. Therefore, I allow Netanyahu to do what he wants. And this time is different. Hezbollah has to respond before the elections for the Israeli opposition to attack Netanyahu and tell him why on earth you have attacked Hezbollah when there is a cessation of hostility and there is a rule of engagement and this group is not attacking us. So why do you want to provoke and kill more Israelis only because Netanyahu desperately needs to become a prime minister? Otherwise, he will go to jail because he's accused of bribery and corruption. So this time, Hezbollah is going to be an effective actor in disturbing the Israeli election, like Iran is a defective actor in disturbing Trump re-election in 2020. And we're going to see that next year. So for the time being, we're talking about Lebanon and Israel. By replying to Netanyahu's violation of the cessation of hostility and the rule of engagement, Israelis are going to die. They're going to be killed. And who is responsible for that is the one who put his finger on the trigger first. That is Netanyahu. And what Israel is doing in the last few days is sending messages with the Americans and with the French saying we are sending many drones that are playing without pilots for Hezbollah to shoot them down. So we are even. And Hezbollah is saying, no, you killed two Lebanese. We are not even. You send bombs inside the capital, Beirut. The suburb of Beirut and Beirut are exactly the same. You've killed people and you bombed one of our places and you bombed a civilian area and populated area. That doesn't go. So this is how Hezbollah is interfering in the election by putting Netanyahu with his back against the wall.
So you believe that, Netanyahu thought he could flex his muscles by, doing these strikes to improve his chances for re-election, and he really didn't think that Hezbollah would strike back.
Well, I really don't know what he believes because he knows Hezbollah. I mean, there's nobody on earth who knows Hezbollah better than Israel. And the language that is exchanged between Israel and Hezbollah has been going on since 1982. They both understand each other and they both understand how to communicate with one another. And they both understand the language of tit for tat. And you hit me here, I hit you there. So you attack here, I go and attack you somewhere else. So this language is very familiar to Israel. I think Netanyahu was driven by the euphoric act of going and hitting not only Syria, but also Iraq and getting away with it and having the unlimited support of President Trump and the White House. So he thought, well, I'm going to hit Lebanon, and I am sure the Lebanese officials are going to stand against Nasrallah and forbid him and prevent him from retaliating. And this is where I'm going to have a free way to go and attack again, because the economic situation of the country is very critical, and also because the last time Israel read perfectly well that Nasrallah, when he said he expecting a war, the reaction of the street was dramatic and mainly caused by my article, when the population was not happy to see a second war, a fourth war, and the Lebanese officials were against any act that could trigger a war. But Nasrallah was not saying, I'm going to go and attack Israel. He was saying, there is going to be war in the Middle East and the chances are extremely high. And we can see the chances are extremely high with Iran all the time, because there are always provocation and we're walking on the edge of the abyss. And we can see today that in Lebanon, things can deteriorate or can just stop after Hezbollah attack. Nobody has the answer.
Right, right. Now, another curious thing that you brought up is that there's a religious event that's going to happen. You say that on the 31st of August, the Amal movement is planning a large gathering in Beirut. And then you say that the first 10 days of Ashura bring most of the Shia in Lebanon, and in particular Hezbollah supporters, to the utmost level of sacrifice. You say Netanyahu could not have chosen worse timing for his violation of the rules of engagement. Now, my bad, I am not very familiar with the religious, events, the Muslim religion in general, and the specific Shia. I don't know if you call them a holiday, but a religious day or a religious period. But what is this Ashura? And it seems contradictory to me. If there's going to be a large gathering of people in Beirut, that would seem like the worst time for some kind of an escalation, particularly because Israel just sent drones with bombs into the urban area of Beirut. So why is this a particularly bad time for Netanyahu to have provoked a retaliation?
Yes, that's a very good question. So I was told by my sources that they expect to hit back within 72 hours. Nevertheless, it is all depends on the opportunity and identifying a selective target. So if they don't find a selective target that satisfies the answer and the reply to Netanyahu enough to convince him not to go through this experience again and to go back and bomb Lebanon, then they might send a precision missile against a selective military target for Israel to understand that this is how the response is going to be. Nevertheless, this action has will reveal some of Hezbollah's capability. And Hezbollah is trying to avoid to reveal all of its capabilities, military capabilities, like the anti-air missile to shoot down a military jet, or the precision missiles that they have since 2006 and were updated by Iran throughout the years in the last 13 years.
So like a classic probing, military probing action, just to cause them to give away where their anti-aircraft and anti-missile sites are.
Yes, so I mean, for Israel, it's very important to know what kind of capabilities are in the hand of Hezbollah. That's why he is waiting to see the kind of answer, if it is going to be the usage of one of Hezbollah's secret capability that were a lot spoken about but never shown. Nevertheless, Hezbollah can use sniper or can use a laser-guided missile and hit specific target that cause casualties among the IDF. I don't know, not even Hezbollah knows. They're just looking for a target, and it can happen while we are talking, it can happen tomorrow, can happen after tomorrow, can happen any day. Now, about the religious celebration, on the 31st of August, it is equivalent to Islamic calendar of the 1st of Muharram. And on the 1st of Muharram, there are 10 days where the Shia around the world celebrate and mourn the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, who was killed in Karbala. And this particular date reminds the Muslim Shia of the value of sacrifice, how this Imam went with his family in the desert and accepted the sacrifice of himself and all of his family with him, just to be on the right side of the history and not to acknowledge an unjust ruler. And that is the spirit of Hezbollah, that's the spirit of the society that supports Hezbollah in Lebanon and across all the Shia world. And in this period of time, the spiritual level of the Shia is extremely high, where the meaning of sacrifice is linked to the sacrifice of the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. Therefore, it is like an invitation to offer themselves, if needed, for a noble cause against the injustice of the world or the ruler. And this is why I said Netanyahu couldn't choose worse time for himself to do his attack than this period of time, because this is where Hezbollah, with just a few words, can fuel the entire society, and this society will be on his side in this particular moment of the year. But in any way, the society is already on his side throughout the year. But in this period, in this month, in these 10 days, is something very special about it.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Unfortunately, because obviously I'm hoping there isn't a war. But yeah, that does make sense. So it's not so much that Netanyahu would be better or worse than Ehud Barak or whoever becomes the next prime minister. The real threat, it sounds like you're saying, is the strong alliance between Netanyahu and Trump, and therefore that's a bigger threat to Hezbollah and its allies in the region, because maybe more of a chance of the United States intervening on behalf of Israel after Israel provokes a war. Whereas if Ehud Barak, let's say Ehud Barak gets into office, then there may be just as strong an alliance between the Trump administration and Barak, but you know, but maybe not. And at the very least, it would take a while for them to, get on the same page and whatever, work out their alliance. Is that sort of what the situation is?
Yes, indeed. So we see Netanyahu bragging about convincing Trump to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal. And we see Netanyahu having a green light from the White House to go and bomb Iraq. And we see Netanyahu having a free hand to do anything he wants, really. And if we really examine what he's doing in Iraq and Syria, I mean, Bashar al-Assad is having back the control of most of Syria. And the 200 plus Israeli bombing did what? Just to bomb a few warehouses, to kill a few Syrian soldiers. They were fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the jihadists. And Netanyahu was killing the Syrian army from behind their back in the night when they are in their barracks and in the day when they fight the jihadists. And he went to bomb 3 to 4 warehouses in Iraq. Is he changing anything strategically? Absolutely not. He's just playing around with the life of few people, destroying few places, saying, I have long arm that can reach anywhere. But strategically, he's doing nothing but provoking the anger toward Israel and fueling the axis of the resistance and giving it more strength to go and attack Israel. And then he goes and play the victim and he say, we are in a hostile environment. So who's taking the initiative? Syria didn't take the initiative to bomb Israel. Iran is not taking the initiative to bomb Israel. And Hezbollah is not taking the initiative to bomb Israel. And Iraq certainly is not attacking Israel because it's very far. So what kind of game he's playing? And the dangerous bit is he has the full support of the White House. He has Trump's full support. I
Yeah.
mean, there's no point for the US. Where is the gain of the American people or the American strategy for Israel to go and hit Iraq, a country that invited the US forces in the country, and where there are pro-Iranians who are going to go and kill Americans because Israel is going and bombing Iraq? And so they don't have Israelis next to them, they have Americans. So what Netanyahu is doing, he is pushing the Iraqis to go and kill Americans who are invited by the Iraqi government to come and support them, just to achieve the bombing of 3 or 4 warehouses full of weapons and missiles. Well, okay, these missiles can be replaced. Is the life of American soldiers can be replaced?
No. And you know, I hope that even an attack would not provoke, a major escalation of the war in Iraq, because he seems to be forgetting about the political situation here. Trump may act triumphant and all of this, but the fact of the matter is, it's by far not sure that he can be reelected. And he's very much aware of that. You can tell that from some of the things that he says, that he knows it too. And I guess it's a good sign. You mentioned that Americans and the French went to Lebanon and offered some, sort of targets that they could shoot down so that it would be a minimal damage retaliation, offering them the opportunity to retaliate and just to tamp this whole thing down. And that tells you that they don't want a war. War with Iran is something that, other than some extremist political actors, unfortunately, some who are in the administration, I don't know of anyone who wants a war with Iran. And there was some serious pushback at high levels the last time we came close to a war with Iran. So, I don't think that if that's what Netanyahu wants, I don't think that he can get that. Now, I'm not 100% confident of that, but I'm hoping that the sentiment is there. I mean, it would be a disaster. Politically, it would be a complete disaster. There's no support among the population for a war with Iran here. Now, if they attack American soldiers in Iraq, the media can't be counted on to accurately portray the situation. But I don't know if they're going to get the response out of the population that they think they will get. I found it really surprising that Israel hit those targets in Iraq. And the Iraqi parliament, what happened there? I mean, they came out and said this was a declaration of war, didn't they?
Well, yes, this is my. You're talking about my next article. I've been writing for the last 3 days about what's happening in Iraq and why Israel is hitting Iraq and what's the benefit. But we see the Israeli Foreign Minister, Israel Katz, saying we are able to strike inside Iran and we are the only ones working against Iran in Iraq. So going to bomb Iraq has no benefit. If he's going to be re-elected or not, we don't know. We don't have any confirmation. And if the Iraqis are going to attack the Americans, it certainly can strongly happen for one simple reason. No suicide drone can be launched in the sky of Iraq without the knowledge of the Americans. And no drone, because Israel used suicide drones against the warehouses, and it uses a normal target killing drone when killing a commander of the Iraqi security forces on the Iraqi-Syrian border, Ali Nadbi. So there is an agreement between the Russian and the Americans that no jet and no plane can fly in the sky of Syria without the knowledge of both sides, the Americans and the Russian, because they want. It's like sorting out the traffic on the ground. It's exactly the same in the sky. They want to know if there is a hostile jet or drone or friendly drone. So when there are drones in the sky of Iraq and they go and bomb warehouses that belong to the federal police and the Iraqi security forces called the Hashd al-Shabi, because they are part of the Iraqi security forces, it cannot be without the knowledge of the Americans, and they are not sent from Israel 1,000 kilometers away to go and bomb a warehouse. They sent from the American bases, and we saw an article saying the White House agreed and the Pentagon disagreed on supporting Israel attack on Iraq. So why on earth, when there are no Israeli soldiers in Iraq that the Iraqis can go and find to express their revenge, there are more than 5,000 American soldiers on the ground. Why the Americans would allow the Israeli to do that when there is no strategic gain of doing it?
Yeah. And that kind of gets into another thing that I'm interested in. So what you just said is that the Israeli drones that attacked the Hashd al-Shabi in western Iraq were launched from an American base in Syria?
Yes, that is correct.
Do we know what base?
Yes, and I can give you an information now. They were monitored by the radars, and in Iraq, they are Russian and Iranian that cover the Iraqi sky.
I don't understand what you just said. I'm sorry.
Okay, so anything that flies in the air is monitored by the early warning radars that are based in military bases. And because there are Russian and Iranians operating in the same operational room in Baghdad in the green zone, that is official, and they are a few hundred meters from the US embassy.
Okay.
They also have advanced radars that can capture anything in the air, including drones, or drones that are trying to hide themselves, because today we have planes and jets and drones that they can believe they can hide themselves from radars. Well, unfortunately for them, there are radars who can capture their presence in the sky. And these radars, who are allies of Iraq and Iraq relies on, informed the Iraqis and gave them the proof that there were drones which departed from the American bases. Now, the Americans are sincere when they said, we did not attack the Iraqis. Of course they didn't, because it's not in their advantage, because they are present in many military bases training Iraqis. So they did not attack, but they allowed Israel to attack, which is more or less the same. Now, when they train in military bases, in Iraqi military bases, and they train Iraqis, who can guarantee their safety after that?
Oh, that's a really bad situation. So basically, we're allowing the Israeli military to operate on our bases in Syria and Iraq?
In Iraq, they don't need in Syria because they are on Israel and Syria have borders together. So they just fly from Syria, and they are in 1 minute in Syria. They're from Israel, and they are in 1 minute in Syria. And now, because they are afraid of the Syrian anti-air missiles, they're flying over Lebanon, violating the Lebanese airspace. And from the Bekaa Valley, they launched their missiles against Syrian targets.
Yeah. Huh. Let's talk real quick about Tanf, because I have to let you go in a few minutes. I mean, we've known about Tanf for a long time, but I personally have always been confused by this base. You know, it's my understanding. I've looked at it on the map. There's not much to see. It's like a patch in the desert. It was originally used to train the another form of the so-called rebels. I think they called them the new Syrian army or some such. They launched some attacks in eastern Syria that were not very successful. And, you know, since then, we didn't hear that much about Tanf, but every time there is a proposition to make some kind of a deal, the Americans say, well, we're not giving up Tanf. And I cannot understand why that is such an important, I guess it's a strategic position, but why is that such an important base? And has it grown in importance? Has it grown in, there wasn't much infrastructure that I knew of there. Like what is Tanf at this point? And, why are we holding on to it? Why is it so important? It looks to me like it's going to be difficult to hold that. So can you just kind of update me on what's going on with Tanf and what's there and what's been going on with it recently?
Very good question, because many people now are forgetting about about the Tanf and what's happening there. So basically, the answer is extremely simple. Between Iraq and Syria, there are many crossing points. Tanf is one of the most famous crossing points because it can easily be controlled by the Syrian and the Iraqi armies. It's a clear road that has been completely cleared from ISIS, and all of ISIS have disappeared from the area, and it is all under the control of the Syrian army and its allies. Opening the road, meaning the commercial relationship between Syria and Iraq will regain. Now, the Americans stopped the crossing between Syria and Jordan, because they don't want for Syria to recover financially and economically. And they are blocking the crossing on a Tanf. Now, you can say there is another crossing that is an Al-Qaim in the north of the country. That is true. But Al-Qaim, this is where there are still many pockets that belongs to ISIS in the Iraqi and the Syrian desert, because it's a very vast desertic area. It's very difficult to clean. It's like we're talking about Mexico and the United States. They've been decades trying to control that, and they still fail. And exactly the same between Syria and Iraq. It's a huge area, that is only desert, but full of caves, full of places where ISIS militant can hide there. And because of that, the Americans don't want a Tanf to be used and want the Syrian and the Iraqis, if they want to use, they use Al-Qaim, because Al-Qaim can be easily under insurgency and terrorist attacks. That's why they leave Al-Qaim, because they have no other choices. But in Al-Tanf, they are there and they say they are training Syrians, but for which purpose? I mean, we have around 70, 80,000 men in Idlib. And in few days, the Syrian army decided to push to Khan Sheikhoun, and they recovered it in no time. So the few tens of thousands of militants trained by the Americans at El Tanaf will serve no purpose, because the Americans spent previously, in the previous years, $500 million on training Syrian militants who turned to be supportive of Al-Qaeda. And once they were in Syria, they deliver American weapons to Al-Qaeda. So the Americans know very well they are doing nothing there but blocking the business relationship between Syria and Iraq, and they are putting the Syrian and the Iraqis in danger if they use another crossing in Al-Qaim. For the Americans, there is absolutely no benefit to stay there. There's some voices that are really naive, saying we are blocking the passage between Iraq and Syria, and we're blocking the transport of weapons between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. If that is the case, then from where on earth Hezbollah got 150,000 rockets and missiles, according to the Israeli officials? They've got it not from a Tanaf, because the Tanaf is still blocked. They've got it on the route that is usually used and is not taking into consideration Al-Tanaf crossing. Today, Iran is no longer in need to transport weapons throughout the countries. It is transporting the knowledge. It is transporting the know-how. They train their allies and they equip them with enough knowledge to make their own missiles. They don't need to go to the risk of transporting weapons anymore like before. Of course, this is still happening on a very small scale, but nothing like before. So the presence of the Americans at Tanaf has no value for the Americans people, has no value for the Americans military, has no value for anyone but a damage to the Syrian economy.
I see. So it's more about the sanctions regime, the economic war, than any other country.
Americans did the same by preventing all the Gulf countries from returning to Syria and reopening their embassies. And they did the same with Jordan by imposing on Jordan 180 items that are not allowed to be imported from Syria, because they don't want Syria to recover. They're preventing oil from coming to Syria because they want the population to suffer. This is nothing to do with the President Assad. It is to do with just dominating a population, trying to dominate population. But the Syrians are surviving. People adapt. The Americans have no clue how people adapt in war zone. I lived in so many war zones. People adapt with what they have, and they try to survive, and they manage to survive with what they have.
Yeah, well, I mean, they suffer, but yeah, they do survive. In the last minute or two, and maybe this isn't fair, but you have any thoughts on Idlib? It looks like the Syrian army is on the march here. They took Khan Sheikhoun. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, what's happening is Al-Qaeda thought that it is stronger than Turkey and stronger than anyone else. and their leader is in Idlib, in agreement with the leader of Hayat Tahrir Sham, that is used to be Al Qaeda, but now today it has the same ideology of Al Qaeda, but under the different name, and is not necessarily linked to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al Qaeda Central. It is a separate group that found a way to create its own niche and its own raison d'être, and it's not linked to Al Qaeda, but there is another group linked to Al Qaeda. So all the jihadis that are in Idlib today believe they are stronger than Turkey, and they don't need to listen to what Turkey wants. And I'm here referring to the Astana agreement that agreed to open the road between all the area, Hama, Aleppo, until Turkey. And that's why there was an agreement to put a Turkish and a Russian observation points all along the highway M5. So what happened is the jihadists refused to withdraw. And they said, I'm sorry, we're not going to listen to Turkey. We are staying here. So Turkey lifted the support on them, but it still needs to scream because they don't want the jihadists to turn against it. So Turkey is putting a show by saying, we are not happy with what's happening in Khan Sheikhoun. We condemn it. We are against it. But in the meantime, they allow it to happen, and the Syrian army is advancing. Now, what we see in what's happened in Khan Sheikhoun first is the fast and strong, robust recovery of the Syrian army. Second is the capability, the military capability of the Syrian army to plan and recover and liberate a huge zone. It's not only Khan Sheikhoun, it's the whole of North Hama and south of Idlib that has been recovered. And it's a huge area. A third, it's a message to the jihadists that if the political support is lifted on you, you're not going to last days or weeks. You're going to be wiped out. Now, the Russian and the Iranians don't want to upset Turkey very much. And also, they would like to see the Syrian constitution discussed and agreed upon before the Syrian election in 2020. And the constitution has been studied and discussed, and there are hundreds of meetings because of that. Therefore, in the meantime, if the jihadists don't want to allow a safe passage to the Syrian population to cross backward and forward on the highway, then the Syrian army is going to do that by force, and Turkey is going to allow it to happen. But at the same time, we can see a different approach from Turkey that is more keen to start let go of Idlib slowly but surely. Now, they are afraid of the internally displaced population,
Right.
not to migrate from Syria to Turkey. And that's why they want from the Syrian government to find a solution for everybody. And the Syrian government is very much willing to retake all these population and not to harass them or to persecute them, and to accept, because President Assad is very open to the reconciliation, because he has learned throughout the years of war that there is no way to punish the population for what they have done, but to understand that they were manipulated not only by the jihadists, but by another 80 countries around the world that wanted to defeat Russia and stop it from transferring their gas to Europe. And that's why they want to block Iran. That's not signing the deal with Syria to put its gas through Syria and through Turkey and then to Europe, bypass Ukraine. And because they want to defeat the axis of the resistance. So many reasons for the Syrian war. So Assad understands that all these were elements that played with the Syrian population, and it's time to stop the war and embrace the entire population. So for that, he needs the collaboration of Turkey. There are meetings that's happening between the Turks and the Syrian on the intelligence service level, and there are talks, direct talks, and there are indirect talks that happening all the time through the Russian and through the Iranian. And Turkey understands today that the game is much bigger than taking Idlib. The game is to stop arming the Kurds. The game is not to have the Americans on the borders. The game is to look after the financial aspect, because Turkey can gain a lot from Iran, can gain a lot from Syria, can gain from opening its market, embrace the new economy, and they understand that in the US there is a president that is not reliable, that changes his agreements and his mind all the time, and can't abide by any agreement that he has signed or his predecessors has signed. Therefore, they need to look after the economy and not after occupying a small part of Syria, because that doesn't help. And the Turkey slowly is understanding that, but they need to find a solution for the thousands of jihadists and rebels that fight under the Turkish flag, and they want to find a solution for the Syrian internally displaced that live in Idlib today.
Wow, you really summed up an incredibly complex situation there kind of masterfully, Elijah. Bravo for that. Yeah, I think it's been almost a year now since the Turkey was supposed to get their jihadi and other fighters under control. I think it was October of last year was the deadline, and then I remember the patience of the Syrians and I guess the Russians giving them some more time to do it, and now it's been about a year. I know that some people that I talked to had a lot of doubts about the Astana agreement from the start, basically, not believing that Turkey would be able to achieve what they said they would achieve. And it turns out they were right. But interesting that they're going to continue to work toward that Astana agreement. But Turkey has changed their position, and their, this realignment of Turkey is really quite astounding. And other than talking about arms deals here, not that many people are talking about this huge realignment of Turkey, but that's for another day. And I have to let you go. And anything else that you want to say to the audience before we wrap up?
I think we spoke for an hour. I think
Yeah.
they're fed up with me.
No, I mean, you gave us so much information in that hour, Elijah. I really appreciate it. And please do tell everyone where to find your work, how to support your work, and all of that.
Well, I mean, I'm on Twitter, EJMRI, ALRAI, and then I have my blog, and this is where I am, and I write articles and share my knowledge and my experience as much as possible. And I hope the world can read an alternative information rather than the mainstream media that is starting to recover a little bit because they are keeping a little bit further distance from the dirty Syrian war and starting to remember that they are journalists and their job is to offer to the world knowledge and experience, but not to twist the reality.
Well, we can hope, right? We can hope.
Yes, of course. This is ours to hope. Nobody can take it away from us.
This is true. Thanks so much, Elijah. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Elijah Magnier. Follow Elijah on Twitter at EJMALRAI, EJMALRAI. Read and support his work at his website, ejmagnier.com. Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support is important. Please pitch in, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or do one-time donations via PayPal, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Go to our website, you can find these links, aroundtheempire.com. The audio podcast, you can find it in many places. Many ways to listen to it. Find it on any mobile podcast app or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on Patreon, or on YouTube, youtube.com/Around the Empire. And if you're listening on YouTube, hit the thumbs up icon to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. Also follow us on Twitter @Around the Empire. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.